Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now, let's dive into today's story. Meet Richard Edwards, a man who had everything yet nothing at all. Richard was the CEO of Edwards Enterprises, a technology company that had reached the top of the market. He owned mansions, expensive cars, and every luxury you could imagine. But for all his success, Richard lived a life of complete isolation. He had everything in terms of wealth, but love, connection, and real human relationships were foreign to him. His life was a series of meetings, deals, and endless commitments that left him feeling emptier than ever. One evening, Richard found himself at a lavish charity ball, an event he'd only agreed to attend to maintain his company's image. His face was hidden behind a sleek black mask, and he wore a perfectly tailored tuxedo. For him, the mask represented more than just anonymity. It was a shield, a way to avoid being seen for who he truly was. He had gotten used to being seen as just his wealth, his title, and not the man behind the business empire. As the evening progressed, Richard watched as people mingled, exchanged pleasantries, and laughed. Yet, he couldn't shake the feeling of loneliness that clung to him like a shadow. The superficial conversations felt draining, and the grand ballroom, with its chandeliers and opulence, only served to remind him of the emptiness in his heart. Then, across the room, he saw her, Sophie Williams. She wasn't a guest, but rather one of the volunteers working at the event. Sophie stood out in the sea of guests in her simple dress and modest demeanor. Her eyes were warm, sincere, and focused on helping others. Unlike everyone else in the room, Sophie wasn't there for the glamour or the business connections. She was there to make a difference, to truly support the cause. Richard's curiosity was piqued. He found himself drawn to her, something he hadn't felt in years. As the night wore on, he found himself in a corner of the ballroom, away from the crowd, when Sophie appeared beside him, offering him a drink. "I'm sorry to interrupt," she said with a shy smile, "but you look like you could use one." He glanced at her, then at the drink she was offering. A soft laugh escaped his lips. "I'm not sure if I'm the type to need a drink, but thank you." Sophie's eyes softened. "Sometimes, everyone could use a little something to take the edge off," she replied with a hint of playfulness. Richard couldn't help but smile behind his mask, intrigued by her honesty. They began talking, and as the minutes passed, Richard found himself relaxing. For the first time in a long time, he didn't feel the weight of his title. Sophie wasn't impressed by his wealth, and that was exactly what he needed. She was genuine, and he felt that in every word she spoke. They discussed everything from the weather to their favorite books, and Richard felt something stir within him, a connection he hadn't experienced in years. But there was something Sophie didn't know. As much as Richard enjoyed their conversation, he was still hiding behind that mask. The person she was talking to wasn't the real him. He was a man pretending to be just a regular guest at a charity event, someone she could talk to without any preconceptions. He wanted to keep it that way, wanted to savor the feeling of being seen for who he really was, not just as the CEO of a multi-million-dollar company. As the evening came to a close, Sophie gave him a small, kind smile. "It was nice talking to you," she said, as she began to walk away. Richard felt a pang in his chest, a sense of longing as she turned her back to him. He knew he should say something, but the moment slipped away before he could find the words. The night ended, but Richard couldn't forget Sophie. He went back to his penthouse, his mind spinning with thoughts of her. She had seen him, not the mask, not the wealth, but the person underneath. He wasn't ready to face it, but Sophie had unlocked something in him. He knew one thing for sure. He wanted to see her again. Would he risk it all and take off his mask for her? Could he really let someone in? Someone who didn't need him for his money or status. Richard wasn't sure, but he knew that for the first time in years, he was ready to find out. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now, let's dive into today's story. Meet Richard Edwards, a man who had everything yet nothing at all. Richard was the CEO of Edwards Enterprises, a leading tech company. He owned mansions, expensive cars, and all the luxuries life could offer. But for all his success, Richard lived in complete isolation. Despite his wealth, love, connection, and real human relationships were foreign to him. His life consisted of meetings, deals, and endless work that left him feeling emptier than ever. One evening, Richard found himself at a lavish charity ball, an event he only attended to maintain his company's image. He wore a sleek black mask, his tuxedo perfectly tailored. For him, the mask represented more than just anonymity. It was a shield, a way to avoid being seen for who he truly was. He had gotten used to being seen as his wealth, his title, but never the man behind the business empire. As the evening progressed, Richard watched as people mingled, exchanging pleasantries and laughs. Yet, he couldn't shake the feeling of loneliness that lingered around him. The conversations felt draining, and the grand ballroom only reminded him of the emptiness in his life. Then, across the room, he saw her, Sophie Williams. She wasn't a guest, but rather one of the volunteers working the event. Sophie stood out in the sea of glamour in her simple dress, focused on helping others. She wasn't there for the business connections or the luxury. She was there to make a difference. Richard felt drawn to her. It was a feeling he hadn't had in years. As the night went on, he found himself alone in a corner of the ballroom, when Sophie appeared beside him, offering him a drink. "You look like you could use one," she said with a shy smile. He glanced at her, and then the drink she offered. A soft laugh escaped his lips. "I'm not sure if I'm the type to need a drink, but thank you." Sophie's eyes softened. "Sometimes, everyone could use a little something to take the edge off," she replied playfully. Richard couldn't help but smile behind his mask, intrigued by her sincerity. They began talking, and as the minutes passed, Richard found himself at ease. For the first time in a long time, he didn't feel the weight of his title. Sophie wasn't impressed by his wealth, and that was exactly what he needed. She was genuine, and he could feel that in every word she spoke. They discussed everything from the weather to their favorite books. Richard felt a connection, something he hadn't experienced in years. But there was something Sophie didn't know. While Richard enjoyed their conversation, he was still hiding behind the mask. The person she was talking to wasn't the real him. He was just a regular guest at the charity event. He wanted to keep it that way for a while, to savor the feeling of being seen without the baggage of his wealth and status. As the evening came to an end, Sophie gave him a small, kind smile. "It was nice talking to you," she said as she began to walk away. Richard felt a pang in his chest, an odd sense of longing as she turned her back to him. He knew he should say something, but the moment slipped away before he could find the words. The night ended, but Sophie stayed on his mind. Richard went back to his penthouse, his thoughts consumed with her. She had seen him, not the mask, not the wealth, but the person underneath. He wasn't sure if he was ready to face it, but Sophie had unlocked something in him. He knew one thing for sure. He wanted to see her again. Would he risk it all and take off his mask for her? Could he really let someone in? Someone who didn't need him for his money or status? Richard wasn't sure, but he knew that, for the first time in years, he was ready to find out. The days following the charity ball felt like a blur to Richard. He couldn't shake the feeling of Sophie's smile, the warmth in her eyes, and the way she had made him feel seen for the first time in years. He spent his days locked away in his office, yet his thoughts constantly drifted back to her. He kept replaying their conversation over and over in his mind, wishing he could have told her the truth. But the mask had been a wall, a barrier he had built around himself for so long. He wasn't sure if he was ready to take it off, not even for her. It had been a week since the ball, and Richard's loneliness seemed to grow each day. Despite the countless meetings, the endless stream of people passing through his life, he still felt as if something was missing. His success, his wealth, none of it had brought him the connection he craved. He stared at the gold-plated watch on his wrist, a constant reminder of the life he had built. But it was hollow. All of it was hollow. And then, just as he had been mulling over all of this, his phone rang. He glanced at the screen, his heart skipping a beat as he saw the name flash across it, Sophie Williams. For a moment, he hesitated, unsure if he should answer. He hadn't expected to hear from her again. But as the phone continued to ring, he found himself unable to resist. With a deep breath, he swiped the screen and brought the phone to his ear. "Hello," Richard said, his voice a little more unsure than he had intended. Hi, Richard. Sophie's voice came through, warm and familiar. I hope I'm not interrupting anything. Richard smiled softly. Not at all. It's good to hear from you. He leaned back in his chair, the weight of the conversation sinking in. How have you been? I've been good, just keeping busy with the charity work. Actually, I wanted to ask if you'd be interested in attending another event, Sophie said, her tone a little hesitant. Richard raised an eyebrow, intrigued. Another event? What's it for? It's for a fundraiser we're holding next month. It's all for a good cause. I thought you might be interested in attending. If you're free, of course. Sophie's voice carried a hopeful note. Richard thought about it for a moment. His first instinct was to politely decline, to avoid the event, and to keep his distance from Sophie. After all, he didn't want her to know the truth about him, about who he really was. But then he remembered her smile, the way she had looked at him without any expectations. He realized that maybe it was time to stop hiding, to stop living behind the mask. I'd be happy to come, Richard said, surprising himself with how easily the words came out. Count me in. I'll make time for it. There was a brief silence before Sophie responded, her voice soft with gratitude. Thank you, Richard. I knew you'd say yes. It means a lot to me. They spoke for a few more minutes, finalizing the details of the event. When the conversation ended, Richard sat back in his chair, his heart beating a little faster than usual. He had agreed to go, and for the first time in a long time, he was looking forward to something that wasn't just a business deal or a social obligation. He was looking forward to seeing Sophie again. The next few days felt like a whirlwind. Richard made preparations for the event, but his mind was never far from Sophie. He couldn't stop thinking about her, about how different she was from the women he usually surrounded himself with, the women who were always after his wealth and status. Sophie didn't care about any of that. She cared about helping people. She cared about making a difference. As the day of the event approached, Richard felt a mix of excitement and nerves. He had no idea what to expect, but something inside him told him that this could be the start of something real. A connection that went beyond the surface level, beyond the wealth and power. Something deeper. When the night of the fundraiser finally arrived, Richard found himself standing in front of the mirror, adjusting his tie. He wore a sharp suit, but this time, there was no mask. No metaphorical mask either. He was going to be himself, whatever that meant. He wasn't sure what would happen, but he was ready for the possibility of something new. Arriving at the venue, Richard could already feel the difference. The atmosphere was warm, the guests were genuine, and the energy in the room was unlike any he had experienced at his usual high society events. As he entered, he spotted Sophie immediately, standing near the front, talking to a few guests. She looked radiant, her kindness shining through. Richard made his way over to her, feeling the nervous flutter in his chest. Sophie turned when she saw him approaching, her face lighting up in a welcoming smile. She was just as beautiful as he remembered, and for a moment, he felt as though the world around him had faded into the background. Richard, I'm so glad you came, Sophie said, stepping forward to greet him. Her eyes sparkled with excitement, and for a split second, Richard saw the woman behind the mask. The woman who saw him, not as the CEO, but as a person. I'm glad to be here, Richard replied, feeling an unfamiliar warmth spreading through him. As they began talking, Richard found himself more at ease than he had ever been at a social event. For once, he wasn't concerned with making deals or impressing anyone. He was just talking to Sophie, and it felt right. Little did he know, this was the beginning of something that would change both of their lives forever. The fundraiser was in full swing, and Richard found himself immersed in the genuine atmosphere of the evening. The guests were all here for one reason, to make a difference. It was unlike any other event he had attended before, and for the first time in a long while, he felt a sense of purpose beyond business transactions and company growth. Sophie was by his side, explaining the different projects the charity was working on, and as she spoke, Richard couldn't help but be captivated by the passion in her voice. There was no pretense in her words, no hidden agendas. She truly cared about the cause. As the evening unfolded, Richard began to see Sophie in a new light. She wasn't just the woman who had made him feel seen at the charity ball. She was someone who had dedicated her life to helping others, to making the world a better place. And for the first time, Richard felt something stir deep inside him. He had spent so many years building his empire, focusing on his career, that he had never allowed himself to truly connect with anyone on this level. But with Sophie, everything felt different. She made him want to be a better person. Later in the evening, as the event neared its end, Richard found himself alone with Sophie in a quiet corner of the venue. They had stepped away from the crowd to talk more intimately, and Richard felt the weight of the conversation between them. It was no longer just small talk about the charity or the event. This was real, raw conversation. They spoke about their lives, their dreams, and their pasts. Sophie opened up to Richard about her own struggles and triumphs, about the challenges she had faced in the nonprofit world. Richard shared his own feelings of loneliness, how despite having everything, he had never felt truly fulfilled. As the conversation deepened, Richard found himself leaning in closer to Sophie. The connection between them was undeniable, and for the first time in ages, he didn't feel the need to hide behind his wealth or his status. He was just Richard, the man who was beginning to feel something he had long forgotten: human connection. "You know, Sophie," Richard said softly, his voice filled with emotion, "I never realized how much I was missing until tonight. This whole time, I've been living a life surrounded by people who only want something from me. But with you, it feels like I'm actually seen. I don't have to hide anymore." Sophie's eyes softened as she listened to him. She could sense the vulnerability in his voice, and it made her heart ache. She had always believed that people, no matter their wealth or status, were capable of real connection if they allowed themselves to be open. And Richard had done just that. He had allowed himself to be open with her. "Richard," Sophie replied gently, her hand resting on his. "I see you, not as the CEO or the billionaire, but as the person you are underneath all of that. I see your heart, your kindness, and your desire to make a difference in the world. You just have to believe in yourself enough to let others see that too." For a moment, they sat in silence, the weight of her words sinking in. Richard felt his walls begin to crumble, piece by piece. It wasn't just Sophie who had changed him. It was the realization that he didn't have to keep living his life in isolation. He could let someone in. He could trust again. Just as the night was about to end, Sophie stood up, her eyes meeting Richard's with a smile. "I'm glad you came tonight," she said, her voice filled with sincerity. "I think you're starting to see things differently." Richard stood as well, his heart racing. There was no mistaking the chemistry between them, the undeniable pull that had been building since their first meeting. He wasn't sure where this journey would lead, but he knew that he couldn't let it slip away. Not this time. "I'm glad too, Sophie," Richard said, his voice filled with gratitude. "And I think this is just the beginning of something much more important than anything I've built in my life so far." As they exchanged a final smile, Richard couldn't help but feel that everything was finally aligning. For the first time, he wasn't just a CEO. He was a man ready to embrace his true self, ready to be seen for who he truly was. And he was starting that journey with Sophie by his side. The night ended, but something inside Richard had shifted. He wasn't sure what the future held, but he knew one thing for sure. He was no longer afraid to take off the mask and let someone in. Weeks passed since the fundraiser, and Richard found himself thinking about Sophie more than he ever expected. Their conversation at the event had stayed with him, and he couldn't help but feel a shift within himself. He had always prided himself on being in control of his business, his life, his world. But with Sophie, everything felt different. She made him question everything he thought he knew about success and happiness. It wasn't just about the connection they shared, though that was undeniable. It was about how she had made him see that there was more to life than power, wealth, and status. Sophie was like a mirror, reflecting parts of himself he had buried under layers of ambition and self-doubt. For the first time, Richard wanted something more than just business deals and board meetings. One evening, Richard found himself at a crossroads. He had just come back from a high-stakes meeting, his mind clouded with numbers and plans, when he remembered Sophie's words. "You just have to believe in yourself enough to let others see that too." He had been thinking about it for days. He had everything: money, influence, success. But Sophie had made him realize that those things didn't define who he was. Who he was someone who longed for real connection, someone who didn't want to hide behind the mask anymore. He took a deep breath and made a decision. It was time to stop pretending, to stop hiding behind the persona he had created. He needed to see Sophie again, but this time, he was going to be honest with her. No more masks, literal or metaphorical. Richard reached for his phone and typed a message to Sophie. I've been thinking a lot about what you said the other night. I'd like to see you again, if you're free. This time, no masks. He paused before hitting send, a rush of nerves filling him as he stared at the screen. But something inside him told him it was the right thing to do. He hit send. Less than an hour later, Sophie's reply came through. I'm free this weekend. I'd love to see you, Richard. No masks. Just us. Richard couldn't help but smile as he read the words. It was exactly what he had hoped for. They made plans to meet at a quiet cafe, far from the distractions of the charity events and the pressure of the business world. This time, there would be no pretense. Just two people, trying to figure out who they were together. The weekend arrived, and Richard found himself standing outside the cafe, his heart pounding in his chest. He had worn a simple jacket, jeans, and no tie, something that felt strangely freeing. As he entered the cafe, he spotted Sophie immediately. She was sitting at a small table near the window, her smile as warm as ever. She looked just as beautiful in this quiet setting as she did at the charity ball, but it wasn't her appearance that captivated him. It was her openness, her ability to connect with him on a level no one else had. Hey, Sophie said as he approached, her voice soft but filled with excitement. I'm glad you came. I'm glad too, Richard replied, his voice carrying an emotion he couldn't quite place. He sat down across from her, feeling a sense of relief wash over him. For the first time in a long time, he didn't feel the need to impress anyone. He didn't have to be the CEO or the powerful businessman. He could just be Richard. They ordered their drinks, and the conversation flowed easily. They spoke about everything except for the things they had hidden from each other. Richard realized that this wasn't just about the connection they shared. It was about the trust they had begun to build. He found himself laughing in a way he hadn't in years, enjoying the simplicity of the moment. But as the conversation deepened, Richard knew he had to be honest with her. He had to share what he had been avoiding for so long. The truth about who he was and why he had been hiding behind the mask. Sophie looked at him, sensing the shift in his energy. Richard, what's going on? She asked gently. He took a deep breath, his heart racing. Sophie, I'm not just the CEO. I've been hiding behind that title for so long, thinking that it was all I was. But it's not. I'm just a guy who's been scared to let anyone in. Scared of being seen for who I really am. Sophie's expression softened as she reached across the table, taking his hand in hers. I see you, Richard. I always have. The words hit Richard harder than he expected. For the first time in his life, he didn't feel like he had to be anyone other than himself. Sophie wasn't interested in his wealth, his title, or his status. She was interested in him, and that meant more to him than anything. As they continued to talk, Richard realized that Sophie had become more than just a woman he admired. She had become the person who was helping him rediscover who he was, a man who could love, who could connect, who could be vulnerable. And for the first time, he wasn't afraid of that. The evening ended with a quiet promise between them, no more masks. Just the real Richard and the real Sophie, ready to see where this journey would take them. Weeks passed since Richard and Sophie had made the unspoken promise to no longer hide behind masks. Their connection deepened with every meeting. Each time Richard saw Sophie, he felt more like himself. He was no longer the distant CEO with walls built around his heart, but a man who was discovering the power of vulnerability. Their conversations were no longer just about casual topics or superficial pleasantries. They began to explore the complexities of their lives, their dreams, and their fears. Richard found himself sharing things he had never told anyone, things he had buried under years of business deals and public appearances. As time went on, Richard began to realize just how much Sophie had changed his perspective. His world, once dominated by corporate strategy and financial growth, now felt empty without her in it. He had started to value the simple moments they shared, quiet walks, dinners where they talked for hours without distraction, and even the peaceful silence that settled between them as they sat together, simply enjoying each other's company. For the first time in a long time, Richard felt at peace. It was a sunny afternoon when Richard invited Sophie to his apartment, a place he had kept strictly for business meetings and the rare moments of solitude. It wasn't the grand penthouse he typically flaunted at company events, but it was a more personal space, one that he had kept hidden from the world. He wanted to show her the part of him that was no longer just the businessman, but the man who was beginning to truly feel alive. When Sophie arrived, he greeted her with a warmth that was so genuine, it almost surprised him. I thought we could have lunch here today, Richard said, his voice carrying a new sense of comfort. Just us. Sophie smiled, her eyes lighting up at the invitation. I'd love that, she replied, her tone soft but filled with excitement. The simplicity of the moment, just the two of them sharing a meal at his place, felt so real and so different from anything Richard had experienced before. As they sat down to eat, Richard couldn't help but feel a sense of joy at how natural everything felt. There were no cameras, no reporters, no business meetings to attend to. It was just him and Sophie, two people connecting on a deeper level. As they ate, their conversation turned more personal. Sophie asked him about his childhood, and Richard, for the first time, spoke about his upbringing, about growing up in a small town, about the struggles he had faced before his rise to power. Sophie listened intently, not as someone judging or analyzing, but as someone genuinely curious about his past. And as he spoke, Richard realized just how much he had shut off over the years. He had lived so much of his life hiding behind a facade of success, never truly letting anyone in. After a few hours, as they cleared the dishes, Richard found himself thinking about the future. A future that, for once, didn't feel like it was just about business or money. He wanted something real, something he hadn't allowed himself to want for so long. Sophie, Richard began, his voice a little quieter now, I've been thinking about something. About us. And I don't want to hide anymore. I don't want to just be the CEO. I want to be the man who's here with you, right now, without all the distractions. Sophie looked at him, her expression softening. She reached for his hand, her touch gentle. Richard, she said, her voice steady, I've seen who you are. Not the CEO, not the man with all the wealth, but the person who cares, who's willing to be vulnerable. That's who I want to be with. Her words hit Richard in a way he hadn't expected. He had spent so many years thinking that his success was everything, that his wealth was what defined him. But Sophie had shown him that there was so much more to life than that. And for the first time, he didn't feel the need to keep his walls up. He could be himself with her, no masks, no pretenses. As the afternoon drew to a close, they stood by the window, looking out at the city skyline. Richard, feeling an overwhelming sense of peace, turned to Sophie, his eyes searching hers. I'm not sure what the future holds, he said, but I know I want to explore it with you. Sophie smiled, her hand finding his once more. I feel the same way, Richard, she said. Whatever happens, we'll figure it out together. For Richard, that moment, standing next to Sophie with the city stretching out before them, felt like the beginning of something real, something that had nothing to do with his wealth, his title, or his reputation. It was about two people finally finding each other and beginning a journey neither of them had expected. Days turned into weeks, and Richard and Sophie continued to grow closer. They spent more time together, each encounter revealing more about their personalities, dreams, and the places they had come from. Richard found himself thinking about her constantly, and not just in the fleeting moments of their time together. Sophie had become an essential part of his life, and he had never felt so alive. He was no longer trapped in his high-rise office or his solitary, gilded world. With Sophie, he could finally breathe, finally experience what it meant to be truly connected to someone. But despite the warmth between them, Richard couldn't help but feel the weight of his past. He had never allowed anyone to get too close to him before. He had spent years building an empire, and in doing so, he had built walls around his heart, walls that were difficult to tear down. Sophie had seen through those walls, but Richard couldn't escape the lingering doubt. Was he truly worthy of her love, or was he just another man hiding behind his wealth? He had to face that question, and it gnawed at him every day. One evening, as they sat in the park, watching the sunset together, Richard's mind wandered back to his old fears. He turned to Sophie, his voice a little shaky. Sophie, he began, I've been thinking about everything. About us. I've been hiding behind so much. My title, my company, my wealth, and I don't know if I can just leave all of that behind. Sophie looked at him, her eyes filled with understanding. She reached out and took his hand, her fingers warm and steady. Richard, she said softly, you don't have to leave anything behind. You just have to stop letting those things define you. The man I see is the one who cares, who's willing to open up and be vulnerable. That's the man I want. Her words hit Richard like a wave, washing over his doubts and insecurities. He had spent so much of his life believing that his wealth and success were the only things that mattered. But Sophie had shown him that love, connection, and honesty were what truly mattered. She had made him realize that being himself was enough, and he no longer needed to hide. The next few days were filled with quiet moments of reflection for Richard. He realized that Sophie had unlocked a part of him he had long buried. His ability to trust, to love, and to give without expecting anything in return. He had been so afraid of losing himself in a relationship that he had forgotten what it was like to truly be with someone, not because of their status, but because of who they were. He could finally see that with Sophie. He didn't have to worry about being someone he wasn't. She accepted him for all of who he was, flaws and all. On a warm Saturday afternoon, as they walked through the city together, Richard stopped in front of a small cafe, a place he had passed by countless times but never thought much of. He turned to Sophie with a smile. "You know," he said, "I've been thinking. We've spent so much time doing things on my terms, attending events, meeting people from my world. But maybe it's time we do something for you. Just us. No masks, no agendas. Just a quiet afternoon, doing whatever we want." Sophie smiled back, her eyes lighting up with excitement. "I'd love that," she said, squeezing his hand. "Let's go somewhere we've never been before." They spent the day wandering through the city, exploring little shops, eating lunch at a small cafe, and talking about everything and nothing. There was no agenda, no business talk, just the simple pleasure of being in each other's company. And as the day came to a close, Richard realized how much he had changed. He had started out looking for meaning in his success and his wealth, but now he found meaning in Sophie, in their moments together, in the connection they shared. As the sun set and they walked hand in hand down the quiet streets, Richard felt at peace. He had finally found something that mattered more than all the money in the world. Something real, something he could hold on to. And as he looked at Sophie, he knew that he was ready to stop hiding, ready to let her in completely. It wasn't about his wealth, his title, or his status anymore. It was about the love they had found in each other, the kind of love that transcended everything else. "Sophie," Richard said quietly, his voice full of sincerity, "thank you for showing me what really matters. I don't need anything else but you." Sophie smiled, her heart full. "I feel the same way, Richard. We don't need anything but each other." For the first time in his life, Richard realized that he had found what he had been searching for all along, not in the empire he had built, but in the woman by his side. Life felt different now. Richard had changed, and Sophie had played a big part in that transformation. He had allowed himself to feel things he hadn't felt in years: joy, love, and the kind of deep connection that made everything else seem unimportant. The world around him, once defined by business meetings and boardrooms, now seemed less important compared to the quiet moments he shared with her. But despite the peace he felt in his heart, there was still a lingering sense of unease. Richard knew that their connection was real, but there was one thing he had yet to share with Sophie: the truth about his past, the things he had been hiding. It was a rainy afternoon when Richard knew he had to come clean. He had been thinking about it for days, but every time he tried to gather the courage, the fear of losing Sophie held him back. He had built a life based on control, secrecy, and power, but now, with Sophie, he was learning that true strength came from vulnerability and trust. He couldn't keep hiding from her, not if he wanted their relationship to grow deeper. They sat together in Richard's apartment, the soft sound of rain tapping against the windows. Sophie had been quiet for a few moments, sensing that something was on his mind. Richard took a deep breath, his heart pounding in his chest. Sophie turned to him, her eyes searching his face. "What's going on, Richard?" she asked, her voice gentle but filled with concern. Richard looked at her, feeling the weight of the moment. He had always been a man of action, of decisions made quickly and efficiently. But this was different. This wasn't a business deal. This wasn't a negotiation. This was his heart on the line. "Sophie, there's something I need to tell you," he said, his voice shaking slightly. Sophie's brow furrowed as she moved closer to him, sensing the seriousness in his tone. "You can tell me anything, Richard," she said softly. Richard nodded, taking her hand in his. He felt a warmth from her touch, a sense of calm he hadn't known in years. But the words were still hard to say. "Before I met you, my life was about control. I kept everyone at a distance, friends, family, even the people closest to me. I've done things, made decisions that I'm not proud of. and I've kept a lot of secrets." Sophie remained quiet, waiting for him to continue, her grip on his hand firm, letting him know that she was there for him, no matter what. "I built this empire, this company, but I also built walls around my heart. I thought that if I could control everything, I could keep myself from getting hurt. And I thought that wealth would fill the emptiness inside me. But it didn't. And when I met you, I realized how much I had been hiding, not just from others, but from myself." Sophie's eyes softened, her heart aching for him. She knew Richard's success, but she had never understood the pain and loneliness that came with it. "Richard, you don't have to hide anymore," she said gently, her voice filled with tenderness. "I see you. All of you. Not just the CEO, not just the man with all the wealth. I see the person who's capable of so much more than you even realize." Richard looked at her, feeling a mix of gratitude and fear. He was afraid of being rejected, afraid of what Sophie might think of him now that the truth was out. But Sophie's words gave him hope. For the first time, he didn't feel like he had to be perfect. He didn't have to hide his flaws, his mistakes. "I'm not perfect, Sophie," Richard whispered. "I've made mistakes. But I want to be better. I want to be better for you." Sophie smiled softly, her eyes full of warmth and understanding. "You don't have to be perfect, Richard. You're already enough. And I'm here with you, every step of the way." In that moment, Richard realized that he didn't need to be defined by his past mistakes, his wealth, or his title. Sophie had shown him that true love wasn't about perfection. It was about acceptance, vulnerability, and being willing to face the truth, no matter how difficult it might be. As they sat there together, Richard knew that their relationship had entered a new phase. It wasn't just about two people who had met by chance anymore. It was about two people who had chosen each other, despite their flaws, despite their pasts. They had chosen to build something real, something worth fighting for. And for the first time in his life, Richard felt free. Free from the mask, free from the fear, and free to love Sophie with all that he was. The days after Richard's confession felt different, like a weight had been lifted from his chest. Sophie's acceptance, her unwavering belief in him, gave him a sense of peace he had never known. No longer bound by the fear of rejection or judgment, Richard felt a newfound freedom to embrace the life he truly wanted, not the one he had built out of necessity and pride. He was no longer defined by his wealth, his company, or the empire he had spent years building. He was simply Richard, a man who had found something far more valuable: love, trust, and the courage to be vulnerable. But even as Richard embraced this new reality, there was still one obstacle left: the outside world. He had built his empire with a certain reputation, and now, with Sophie by his side, he had to face the inevitable challenge of revealing their relationship to his colleagues, his family, and the people who had only ever known him as the untouchable CEO. He wasn't sure how they would react, especially his family. His father had always expected him to marry someone with status, someone who could help advance the business, not someone like Sophie, who came from a different world altogether. One evening, Richard invited Sophie to a family dinner, a gathering he had avoided for months. It was time for Sophie to meet his family, to see the side of his life that he had kept hidden for so long. He knew it wouldn't be easy, but he was determined to face it, to show Sophie that he was ready to stand by her no matter what anyone else thought. As they arrived at his family's estate, Richard's heart raced. He had never felt more vulnerable. Sophie, who had always been so confident, stood by his side, sensing the tension in the air. She gave him a reassuring smile, her hand slipping into his, silently offering her support. "We'll face this together," she whispered. Inside the grand dining room, Richard's family was already gathered, his father sitting at the head of the table, his mother beside him, and his younger sister chatting with a few family friends. When they saw Richard and Sophie walk in, the room fell into a hush. Richard's father, a man who had built his own legacy with a strict hand, stood up, his gaze shifting between Richard and Sophie with clear curiosity. "Richard," his father began, his tone formal as always, "I wasn't expecting you to bring someone to dinner." Richard swallowed, his throat tight with nerves. "Father, this is Sophie. She's someone very important to me." He could feel Sophie's hand tighten around his, her steady presence calming him as he took a deep breath. The room fell silent, and Sophie, ever graceful, smiled politely, extending her hand to Richard's father. "It's a pleasure to meet you," she said with warmth and sincerity. Thank you for having me. Richard's father didn't immediately return the smile. Instead, he shook her hand with a firm grip, his eyes narrowing slightly, as if measuring her every word and movement. Sophie held his gaze, unflinching, her calm demeanor a sharp contrast to the tension in the room. So, Sophie, his father finally said, his tone cool but not unkind, what do you do? Sophie didn't miss a beat. I work in nonprofit work, she replied, her voice steady. I'm passionate about giving back to communities that need it most. Richard's father raised an eyebrow. Nonprofit work, he repeated. I suppose that's noble, but I hope you understand the importance of business in this world. It's not enough to just give back. Sophie smiled politely, but there was a spark in her eyes. I do understand, but I also believe that business can be a tool for good. The impact we make on the world, whether through a company or through helping others, is what truly matters. Richard watched his father's reaction, sensing the change in the atmosphere. His father was clearly not accustomed to hearing such a response from someone outside of his business world. But Sophie's words had landed with honesty and conviction, and for the first time, Richard felt proud of the woman standing by his side. The evening continued with polite conversation, but Richard could feel the shift. His father, though not fully convinced, had softened. Sophie's grace and authenticity had left an impression, even if it wasn't immediately apparent. After dinner, as they left the estate, Richard turned to Sophie, a mixture of relief and gratitude flooding through him. Thank you for being so amazing tonight, he said, his voice filled with sincerity. Sophie smiled, her hand resting on his. You don't have to thank me. I'm here with you, Richard. We'll face everything together. As they walked away from the dinner, Richard realized that he didn't need his family's approval to be happy. He didn't need to impress anyone anymore. What mattered was Sophie, the woman who had helped him find himself, and the love they shared. He didn't need to hide anymore. And for the first time in his life, he was ready to live for himself, with the woman he loved by his side. After the dinner, Richard and Sophie took a few quiet moments to themselves, walking through the city streets, their hands intertwined. The evening had been filled with tension, but Sophie's steady presence had helped Richard realize something important. No matter what his family thought or how difficult the situation was, the only thing that truly mattered was the life they were building together. Richard had spent so long hiding behind his title, his wealth, and his business empire, but Sophie had shown him a different way, a way of living authentically and wholeheartedly. The more time they spent together, the more Richard realized that he had never felt as alive as he did with her. Sophie had unlocked a part of him he didn't even know existed, and in doing so, she had given him the courage to truly live, to step away from the persona he had been forced to wear for so long. Their relationship was no longer about appearances or obligations. It was about love, true love, built on trust, mutual respect, and understanding. One evening, a few weeks later, Richard made a decision. He had been thinking about it for a while, and now, standing at the edge of a new chapter in his life, he knew what he had to do. He turned to Sophie, his heart racing with excitement. Sophie, he said softly, his voice filled with emotion. There's no one else I want in my life. No one else I want to build a future with. Will you marry me? The question hung in the air for a moment, the world around them fading into the background as Sophie's eyes widened. She blinked a few times, surprised, but then her lips curved into a soft, joyful smile. Richard, she whispered, her voice full of warmth. I've never been more sure of anything in my life. Yes, I will marry you. In that moment, everything clicked into place for Richard. He didn't need approval from his family or society to know what was right. All he needed was Sophie. With her, he had found something far more valuable than wealth or status. He had found a partner, a soulmate, someone who made him feel truly seen and loved. And that was more than enough. The following weeks were filled with excitement and joy as they planned their wedding together. There were no extravagant celebrations, no business partners to impress, just a quiet ceremony with their closest friends and family, a reflection of the life they were choosing to build. It was simple, intimate, and perfect in every way. Richard realized that the most important moments in life weren't the ones filled with wealth or recognition. They were the moments spent with the people you loved, the ones who saw you for who you truly were. On the day of the wedding, Richard stood at the altar, his heart pounding as he waited for Sophie. When she finally walked down the aisle, he couldn't help but smile. She was beautiful, not just in appearance, but in every way that mattered. As she reached him, he took her hands in his, feeling the warmth of her touch, and for the first time, he felt completely at peace. The ceremony was brief, but it didn't need to be anything more. Their vows to each other were simple but heartfelt, spoken from the depths of their hearts. "I promise to love you," Richard said, his voice steady but full of emotion. "To cherish you, and to be by your side through every challenge and every joy." Sophie smiled at him, her eyes glistening with love. "I promise to be your partner in everything, to support you, and to always be there, no matter what comes our way." As they exchanged rings and shared their first kiss as husband and wife, Richard felt a sense of joy and fulfillment that he had never known before. This was what he had been searching for all along. Someone to share his life with, someone who made him better, someone who loved him for exactly who he was. And as they walked down the aisle together, hand in hand, Richard knew that this was just the beginning of their journey. The future was full of unknowns, but with Sophie by his side, he knew they could face anything together. It wasn't about wealth or status. It was about love, and that was all they needed. From that day forward, Richard and Sophie lived their lives not as a CEO and his partner, but as two people who had found their home in each other. They built a life together based on the values that mattered most: trust, love, and mutual respect. And as the years passed, Richard knew he had made the right choice. Sophie wasn't just the love of his life. She was his partner, his equal, and the woman who had shown him what true happiness really meant.